What if the most important thing in this controversy is not whether the title is correct, but why the title had to carry so much weight in the first place? Sit with that for a moment. Because the public wants the narrow question. The narrow question is clean. Did the degree exist? Was the institution accredited? Was the title used accurately? Was the person licensed? Was the public misled? Those questions matter. I'm not asking you to ignore them. A credential claim is not a poem. It has a factual relationship to institutions, records, accreditors, licensing boards, and scope of practice. If someone presents expertise to the public is allowed to ask what that expertise is, where it came from, and what it legally permits. But the narrow question is not the whole question. The deeper question is why one syllable became a load-bearing structure, doctor. One word, 2 beats, a prefix before the name, and yet it changes the entire room before the person says anything. It changes pricing, it changes booking, it changes deference. It changes whether an audience hears the sentence as advice, coaching, therapy, scholarship, testimony, branding, or ministry. It creates a presumption of institutional processing. It says before the first argument is made, this person has been through a machine you already recognize. That is why the title is not merely a title. It is a technology of first contact. For some people, that technology adds prestige. For others, it provides cover. For Black women in particular, it can interrupt default diminishment. It can slow the social reflex to over-familiarize, first name, maternalize, sexualize, spiritualize, or domesticate. It creates a buffer between the speaker and a room already trained to hear Black women as expressive before expert, useful before authoritative, therapeutic before technical, inspirational before intellectual. This does not make every use of the title legitimate. It means the title is doing more work than the public admits. That is the tension we have to hold. A title can be ethically consequential and socially necessary at the same time. It can be a legitimate professional designation and a survival prosthetic. It can clarify competence in one context and obscure scope in another. The public debate usually cannot tolerate that duality. It wants a courtroom, innocent or guilty, expert or fraud, doctor or not doctor, licensed or illegitimate, but institutions do not work that cleanly. Let me be precise. A doctorate is not licensure. Licensure is not expertise. Expertise is not ethics. Ethics is not prestige. Prestige is not public impact. Public impact is not legal scope of practice. These categories touch each other, but they are not interchangeable. The collapse of these categories is where the spectacle begins. A person may hold a doctorate and not be licensed. A person may be licensed and still be mediocre. A person may be unlicensed and still offer non-clinical coaching, teaching, public education, or motivational frameworks. A person may do meaningful community work and still owe clarity about what services are being sold. None of these distinctions protects anyone from accountability. They protect the public from bad analysis. And bad analysis is exactly what platform controversy rewards. The internet compresses categories because compression creates verdicts. Verdicts travel faster than distinctions. Once the public sees a contested title, the platform has a perfect object. A person, a prefix, a screenshot, a biography, a missing record, a defiant response, a moral drama. The whole thing becomes narratively efficient. The institution fades. The woman becomes the entire file. That is where Black feminist theory becomes not decorative, but necessary. Kimberly Crenshaw's intervention was never merely that people have multiple identities. That is the seminar room version. The harder claim is that institutions misread people when their harms are sorted into single-axis categories. A Black woman is not first raced, then gendered, then classed, then credentialed. She is processed through those systems simultaneously. Her authority arrives already overdetermined. Patricia Hill Collins gives us another tool, the outsider within. The Black woman can be near the institution, useful to the institution, fluent in the institution's codes, and still not fully sheltered by its presumptions of legitimacy. She can do the work and remain unofficial. She can know the room and still not own the key. She can master the language of authority while being treated as if the authority itself is borrowed. That is why this case is analytically volatile. It is not simply a story about one disputed title. It is a story about the credibility market revealing its price system. Some people receive temporary belief while documentation is reviewed. Others receive temporary suspicion until documentation is impossible to contest. That difference is not emotional, it is structural. The public says, just show the proof, but proof does not circulate in a neutral atmosphere. Some bodies are believed provisionally, others are audited immediately. Some people are allowed ambiguity while the facts are clarified. Others are converted into cautionary tales before the record is complete. And once the public senses that a Black woman may have occupied expert status without satisfying the public's preferred ritual of proof, the tone often changes. It stops sounding procedural, it starts sounding intimate. It becomes less about consumer clarity and more about status discipline. Status discipline is what happens when a person is punished not only for what they may have done, but for where they dared to stand. That is the first mechanism. The title is the surface. The deeper machine is the distribution of belief. The conventional model says legitimacy is earned in sequence. First, education, then credential, then license if required, then practice, then reputation, then public trust. That sequence is clean enough to put on a brochure. It is also incomplete. The real sequence begins earlier. Family knowledge, school counseling, application literacy, tuition capacity, time to delay income, test preparation, recommendation letters, mentorship, professional association access, conference travel, internship networks, supervisors, unpaid or underpaid clinical hours, knowing which accreditation matters, knowing which license maps to which scope, knowing which title can be used in which setting without creating confusion. Legitimacy is not simply earned, it is pre-distributed. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths in the credential market. Credentials certify achievement, but they also record access. They show what a person learned, but they also show what a person could afford to survive. The public prefers the moral story because the moral story is simpler. It says the credentialed person followed the rules, therefore trust them. It says the uncredentialed or ambiguously credentialed person did not follow the rules, therefore suspect them. But the rules are not merely written. They are socially transmitted. That is where the class machine hides. A person from an elite family does not merely know that degrees matter. They know which degrees matter, from which institutions, in which order, with which supervisors, with which publication record, with which license, and with which public phrasing. They know the difference between a PhD, a PSYD, an EDD, an LMFT, an LCSW, an LPCC, a psychologist license, a coaching certification, a certificate program, and a continuing education credential. They know when a title is legally protected, when it is professionally sensitive, and when it is socially ambiguous. Most people do not know this, so the public consumes authority aesthetically. The website looks official, the title sounds clinical, the language sounds therapeutic. The media outlet books the guest, the audience relaxes. The platform converts the aura into attention. Then, when controversy hits, the same public that consumed the aura demands perfect bureaucratic literacy retroactively. This is the fraud of the legitimacy market. Not fraud in the criminal sense, fraud in the structural sense. The system sells simplicity at the front end and enforces complexity at the back end. A doctoral title sounds simple. Accreditation is not simple. A university can be institutionally accredited, while a specific program has or lacks programmatic accreditation. A professional association can accredit doctoral programs, but not master's programs. A closed university can create record retrieval problems. A degree can exist without creating licensure. A person can be trained in a field and still not be legally permitted to practice under a protected title. A coach can use therapeutic language without being a therapist, sometimes legally, sometimes confusingly, sometimes irresponsibly. That is not a defense of vagueness. It is an indictment of the public's credential illiteracy. The life coaching economy grows precisely inside this confusion. It borrows from therapy, ministry, self-help, motivational speaking, trauma language, relationship advising, and entrepreneurial branding. The product is not always therapy, but the emotional need is often therapeutic. The client may not know the difference. The platform may not care. The coach may benefit from the ambiguity. The licensing board may not be positioned to police every aesthetic imitation of clinical authority. This is the zone where ethical clarity becomes critical. A serious public-facing practitioner should make scope obvious, not hidden in a footer, not implied through vibes. Obvious. What is this service? Is it therapy? Is it coaching? Is it psychoeducation? Is it spiritual counsel? Is it entertainment? Is it a workshop? Is it a clinical intervention? Is there confidentiality? Is there mandated reporting? Is there diagnosis? Is there treatment? Is there supervision? Is there a license number? Is there no license number? The public should not have to decode the service from the font weight of a website. But here is the complication. Once a black woman enters this ambiguity field, the public's tolerance for ambiguity shrinks. The same looseness that becomes personal branding for one person becomes moral evidence against another. A white male founder can exaggerate a title and be called visionary. A celebrity investor can speak outside his competence and be called opinionated. A media therapist can blur categories and be called accessible. A black woman does it, and the question can become, who gave her permission? That is not an argument against standards. It is an argument against selective intensity. Evelyn Brooks. Higginbotham's politics of respectability helps explain the trap. Respectability can function as protection. It can allow black people to demonstrate discipline, education, refinement, and institutional readiness in a society eager to stereotype them. But respectability can also become a surveillance device. It says, you may enter, but only if you remain perfectly legible. You may rise, but only if your rise is institutionally clean. You may speak, but only if your tone reassures the audience that you know your place. Credential discourse becomes one of the modern languages of respectability. The demand is not only show the degree, the deeper demand is perform the kind of humility that makes your authority tolerable. And when that humility is refused, the controversy escalates, not because the facts have changed, because the ritual has been interrupted. To understand why this controversy became so charged, you have to stop treating black women's authority as a recent media problem. It is older than the platform. Black women in America have repeatedly been placed in a contradiction, expected to heal communities while being denied full authority as knowers. They have been caregivers, organizers, teachers, church mothers, midwives, domestic workers, political strategists, writers, moral witnesses, and social infrastructure. But the same society that consumed their labor often refused to recognize their knowledge as expertise. This is the hidden history beneath the credential debate. The question is not only whether someone has the right letters after the name, the question is why black women so often need letters to force recognition of knowledge the culture has already used. During slavery and after emancipation, black women carried forms of practical knowledge that institutions did not name as expertise: reproductive knowledge, survival knowledge, community knowledge, emotional knowledge, political knowledge, economic knowledge, child-rearing knowledge under violent constraint, domestic knowledge gathered inside white households, knowledge of power learned at close range. Collins's outsider within is not an abstract identity phrase. It describes a specific epistemic location. Black women were close enough to dominant institutions to observe them, but not fully included enough to be protected by them. That position can produce sharper perception. It can also produce exhaustion because the person sees the machine while being denied the authority to name it. This is why black feminist thought repeatedly returns to self-definition. Self-definition is not merely affirmation. It is a counter-institutional act. It says, if the dominant archive misnames me, I will not wait for it to correct itself. I will name the conditions of my own life. I will name the knowledge produced by my position. I will name the system that benefits from making my knowledge look informal. But self-definition becomes dangerous when it collides with credential capitalism. Credential capitalism says knowledge must pass through recognized institutions to become legitimate. Black feminist self-definition says institutions have historically misrecognized, under-recognized, or extracted black women's knowledge. The collision creates a dilemma. Enter the institution and risk being disciplined by its rules. Refuse the institution and risk being dismissed as informal. Borrow institutional language and risk being accused of trespass. Build parallel authority and risk being called illegitimate. That is the maze. The Combahee River Collective gives us the sharpest structural language here. Interlocking oppression. Race, sex, class, and sexuality are not separate lanes. They are fused conditions. In a credential controversy, that means the public is not simply reviewing academic paperwork. It is also reviewing the body that claims the paperwork, the class position implied by the paperwork, the gendered expectations attached to authority, and the racial history of who gets to be believed. That is why the backlash often exceeds the alleged violation. If the only concern were consumer protection, the conversation would be narrower. It would ask, what degree is being claimed? What records exist? What institution awarded it? What accreditation applied? What license exists? What services were sold? What representations were made to clients? What laws govern the relevant practice areas? That would be rigorous. But public controversy rarely stays there. It moves to ridicule. It studies tone, clothing, voice, spirituality, appearance, confidence, grammar, romantic history, facial expression, and refusal. It turns one credential question into total personhood review. That is Misogynoir's signature. Moya Bailey's concept of misogynoir names anti-black misogyny directed at black women, especially as it travels through media and digital culture. The key insight is not merely that black women face racism and sexism, it is that the combination produces specific representational patterns: suspicion of anger, mockery of confidence, eroticization of visibility, resentment of authority, pleasure in humiliation, and rapid conversion of ambiguity into guilt. Misogynoir thrives before proof arrives. It lives in the interval. The moment between question and answer becomes a theater. The platform fills the gap with insinuation. The public fills the gap with jokes. The algorithm fills the gap with repetition. By the time documentation is clarified, the person has already been narratively processed. That is why the historical frame matters. Black women have long been asked to be healers without being treated as intellectuals, moral anchors without being treated as professionals, community infrastructure without being treated as institutions. When one of them claims a title that forces professional deference, the title carries the pressure of that entire history. Again, this does not settle the factual dispute. It explains the social electricity around it. The title did not create the storm. The title touched a buried wire. Now let us build the mechanism cleanly. There are 5 layers. Layer 1 is the degree claim. What credential is being represented? Is it a doctorate, a master's, a certificate, an honorary title, a religious title, a coaching title? The public often collapses these, but institutions do not. The exact credential matters because the exact credential defines the category of authority being invoked. Layer 2 is the institution. Which institution awarded it? Was the institution open at the time? Was it accredited? By whom? At what level? Institutional accreditation tells one story. Programmatic accreditation tells another. The distinction is not cosmetic. It determines how the credential travels across professional systems. Layer 3 is licensure. Does the person hold a state license for the regulated service being offered? If they are practicing psychology, therapy, social work, counseling, or marriage and family therapy, which board governs the scope? What examination was required? What supervised hours were required? Is the license active? Is it expired? Is there discipline? Layer 4 is representation. What did the person tell the public? What did the website imply? What did clients reasonably believe they were buying? Did media producers label the person in a way the person approved, ignored, corrected, or exploited? Did the person distinguish coaching from therapy? Did they provide disclaimers? Were the disclaimers meaningful or decorative? Layer 5 is reception. How did the audience process the claim? Did they hear the title as academic expertise, clinical authority, spiritual authority, celebrity branding, or general wisdom? Reception matters because public harm often happens not only through what is said, but through what the audience is encouraged to believe. That is the surface mechanism. Now watch the collapse. The public takes these 5 layers and turns them into one word: fake. That collapse may feel satisfying. It is also analytically lazy. There is a difference between an unverifiable claim, a disputed claim, an exaggerated claim, a misleading claim, an unlawful claim, and a false claim. There is a difference between not being licensed and lying about licensure. There is a difference between using therapeutic language and providing regulated therapy. There is a difference between a degree from a troubled institution and no degree. There is a difference between missing public proof and disproven existence. Precision matters because without precision, accountability becomes spectacle. But precision also threatens spectacle. It slows the feed down. It requires people to learn the difference between a doctorate and a license. It requires them to understand accreditation levels. It requires them to distinguish consumer protection from public punishment. It requires them to hold uncertainty without converting uncertainty into entertainment. Platforms hate that. The platform wants category collapse because category collapse creates velocity. The simpler the accusation, the faster it spreads. The faster it spreads, the more people attach themselves to the verdict. The more people attach themselves to the verdict, the more socially expensive it becomes to revise. That is why the first viral frame often wins. Once the public has decided that a person is a fraud, later distinctions sound like excuses. If the person produces documentation, the documentation is too late. If the person explains accreditation, it sounds evasive. If the person distinguishes coaching from therapy, it sounds technical. If the person refuses to provide more, it sounds arrogant. If the person becomes emotional, it sounds manipulative. If the person remains calm, it sounds sociopathic. The process has no natural exit. This is what I mean by a public execution device. Not execution in the literal sense, execution as status removal. The platform does not merely ask whether the title is accurate. It performs a demotion. It strips the prefix in public. It places quotation marks around the title. It forces the person's name to circulate as a correction. It turns identity into a footnote. Not really, allegedly, self-proclaimed, so-called. Those linguistic moves are small, but they matter. They are how the crowd reclaims status. And this is where the asymmetry becomes visible. Some people are corrected privately. Others are corrected publicly. Some are allowed to clarify. Others are made to confess. Some retain complexity. Others become the allegation. Some are investigated as professionals. Others are consumed as characters. The public says everyone would be treated the same. That is not historically serious. Black women's authority is often treated as provisional even after achievement. Their errors are read as essence. Their ambiguity is read as motive. Their defensiveness is read as guilt. Their confidence is read as evidence of deception. Their refusal is read as contempt. A serious analysis must be able to say 2 things at once. First, public-facing expertise requires transparency, especially in mental health adjacent markets. The audience deserves clarity about degree, license, scope, and service category. Second, the demand for transparency can be colonized by misogynoir, class resentment, platform incentives, and status discipline. Those 2 statements do not cancel each other. They are the minimum required for adult analysis. The hidden wiring is not the title. The hidden wiring is the credibility regime. A credibility regime is the system that decides who gets provisional belief, who must overprove, who receives institutional cover, who absorbs institutional confusion, who gets to be ambiguous, who gets to be complicated, and who is reduced to the worst unresolved question attached to them. That regime has 4 engines. The first engine is institutional opacity. Credentialing systems are too complex for ordinary audiences to read. Accreditation, licensure, degree type, scope of practice, supervised hours, state boards, and institutional closure all operate in different registers. That opacity creates room for legitimate confusion and illegitimate exploitation. The public cannot easily tell which is which. The second engine is media authority laundering. Producers, podcasts, television segments, conferences, and social platforms need experts. They often convert recognizable branding into credibility without auditing the underlying categories. The guest arrives with a title, a platform, a book, a following, a cause, a compelling story. The media appearance then becomes evidence of legitimacy. The title helps secure the platform. The platform strengthens the title. The circle feeds itself. The third engine is therapeutic demand. People are desperate for care that feels accessible, culturally fluent, immediate, emotionally forceful, and less sterile than formal clinical systems. This is especially true where formal care is expensive, slow, racially alienating, insurance-bound, geographically unavailable, or historically distrusted. The market responds with coaches, healers, speakers, influencers, pastors, authors, and public experts who occupy the space between care and content. The fourth engine is his platform punishment. Once ambiguity becomes scandal, the same system that rewarded the aura of expertise profits from dismantling it. Clips circulate, doubt circulates, defiance circulates, reaction circulates. Everyone extracts value from the unraveling. Notice the structure. The individual may benefit from ambiguity, but the system also benefits from ambiguity. Universities benefit from prestige language. Media companies benefit from authoritative guests. Platforms benefit from outrage. Audiences benefit from simplified trust. Coaches benefit from therapeutic aesthetics. Licensing systems benefit from being treated as clean arbiters without having to explain how inaccessible or confusing the pathway can be. Then, when the ambiguity becomes controversial, the individual becomes the dumping ground. This is Sarah Ahmed's institutional lesson. Institutions often preserve themselves by relocating the problem onto the person who makes the problem visible. The woman becomes too visible. The system becomes atmosphere. That is the vanishing act. A serious lecture cannot end by saying, therefore, the person is innocent. That would be too simple. It also cannot end by saying, therefore, the person is fraudulent. That may be emotionally satisfying, but it lets the machinery escape. The sharper ending is this. The controversy is diagnostic. It diagnoses public credential illiteracy. It diagnoses the unstable boundary between coaching and therapy. It diagnoses media's hunger for marketable experts. It diagnoses the way Black women's authority is placed under immediate interpretive pressure. It diagnoses how quickly legitimate accountability can become pleasure in public demotion. It diagnoses a society where institutional trust is collapsing, but institutional symbols still price attention. That last point matters. We no longer fully trust institutions, but we still use institutional symbols to decide who gets heard. That is why the doctor title is so powerful. It carries the memory of an institution, even when institutional trust itself is degraded. It is a relic and a currency at the same time. The public both resents it and obeys it. That contradiction produces the violence of the reaction. Who gets to be complicated? That is the final question. Some people get unclear archives, failed institutions, complicated career paths, ambiguous titles, messy records, public reinventions, and still retain personhood. Their contradictions are treated as texture. Their gaps are treated as context. Their overstatements are treated as branding. Their refusal to answer is treated as privacy. Others do not get that elasticity. Their ambiguity becomes essence. Their missing document becomes identity. Their confidence becomes motive. Their public work becomes suspect. Their title becomes a crime scene. That is the credibility regime at work. So yes, credentials matter. Yes, licensure matters. Yes, public-facing expertise should be transparent. Yes, mental health adjacent markets need sharper boundaries. But also, we need to ask why correction so often becomes theater when the person being corrected is a Black woman. Why proof demands become intimate. Why humiliation becomes a substitute for rigor. Why institutions disappear. Why platforms escape scrutiny. Why audiences confuse cruelty with intelligence. Why a public dispute over a prefix becomes a referendum on whether a Black woman had permission to stand in the expert position at all. That is not legitimacy. That is captivity dressed as standards. And once you see it, you start seeing the same mechanism everywhere. Not only in this controversy, everywhere authority is priced before truth is examined.